Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, the Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Protecting Pollinators. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of our regional programs across the country. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're largely nonprofit and volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, Deep Roots Kansas City, and Rescape California. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Jodi Helmer. She's an author and lecturer specializing in topics about food, farming, and the environment. Jodi's work has appeared in many national publications, and she's authored 6 books, including Protecting Pollinators, How to Save the Creatures That Feed Us. Jodi lives on a small rural homestead in rural North Carolina, where she grows flowers and vegetables, keeps bees, and raises chickens, goats, and one very spoiled donkey. Welcome, Jodi.
Thank you so much for having me, Penny. So thanks everyone for joining today. I hope you're all practicing social distancing and thinking about pollinators during this time. I am excited to chat with you a little bit about the research in my book, Protecting Pollinators, How to Save the Creatures That Feed Our World. And I'll be going through some slides and talking to you a little bit about who the pollinators are, why they matter, and what we need to do to save them. So let's get started. So who are the pollinators? One of the things that I discovered as I was writing this book is that people don't often think about pollinators beyond bees. So I was working on the book and I would say, oh, I'm working on this book about pollinators. And people would ask, how's the bee book coming? Or you're writing about bees, right? And yes, I was absolutely covering bees, but there are so many other pollinators that we need to think about. So honeybees are, of course, the most obvious pollinator, but they're certainly not a native pollinator. They're here from Europe and are managed. So, you know, they live in hives. Beekeepers manipulate the hives. They divide them, they spread them, they move them around to get those pollinators where they need to be. The other pollinators that are native to the US and often get overlooked are things like bats and moths and hummingbirds and all sorts of native bees and beetles. These creatures all do the very important job of pollination. And so when you think about the pollinators, you need to think beyond the honeybees and be considering all of these other creatures who are living in our landscapes and need our help in order to thrive. So the next question is, why do we need pollinators? And there's a very simple answer. Pollinators are responsible for 1/3 of the food we eat. In other words, 1 out of every 3 bites of foods ranging from coffee and chocolate to blueberries and tomatoes rely on insect pollination. And I think that we often forget, because our lessons about pollination were many, many years ago, likely around the 3rd grade, we often forget what pollination is. And so I just want to take a moment in case anyone needs a refresher. There are 3 different kinds of pollination: self-pollination, wind pollination, and insect pollination. And self-pollination is as it sounds. It's where the pollinator, the male and female parts of the plant, are close enough that they can pollinate themselves. Wind pollination happens, again, as the name suggests, when the wind carries these grains of pollen from one plant to the other, and they don't require any insect pollination. And when we think about wind-pollinated crops, they are most of our row crops. So corn and wheat and soy, those things are all wind-pollinated. Insect pollination, or cross-pollination, is the most common kind of pollination for diverse crops like fruits and vegetables. And it only occurs between two plants of the same species. In other words, a rose bush cannot pollinate a peony, to use a floral example. And it happens when insects land on one flower to feed on the nectar, and then they move to the other flower, taking the grains of pollen with them, and they go ahead and cross-pollinate those plants. And so in order to have some of our very favorite foods, we need pollinators. Pollinators are also, of course, really important to biodiversity. So our landscapes would look significantly different if we didn't have these insect pollinators to help do this work, to create, natural pollination, I guess, of plants, right? So without insects, our landscape would just look different. They're essential to maintaining biodiversity, okay? But our pollinators are threatened, okay? So this is really important. There are several things that are happening to our pollinators that are wildly affecting their populations. Okay? Habitat loss, pesticide use, invasive species, and climate change are all having an impact on our pollinator populations. So currently there are about 200,000 species of pollinators, and about 50% of them, so half of our pollinators, are threatened or endangered, okay? And so we're seeing these massive shifts in the number of pollinators, and we're especially concerned about native pollinators because, as I said, with managed pollinator populations like honeybees, the beekeeper can do some of the work in order to help those populations survive, things like providing winter food and splitting hives in order to increase the population. Those are all things that management helps control, and it's certainly not a panacea for honeybee health, but we have all sorts of ways to control managed species that we don't in order to control or support native species. And so we need to be thinking about the things that are affecting pollinators and, of course, what we can do to minimize those impacts. So let's start with habitat loss. So between 2008 and 2011, 23 million acres of native grassland, scrubland, and wetland were converted to row crops like corn and cotton. So we're seeing these mass landscape changes that are eliminating habitat for pollinators. And what happens, because crops like corn, of course, are not cross-pollinated, as we just talked about, and because they're not cross-pollinated and they don't provide much usable nectar or habitat for native pollinator populations, when plants like these move in, pollinators move out. And so that is really important. It's a huge threat to their survival. They can't make their homes in cornfields or between the blades of grass in our suburban lawns that we love so much. And so a lot of the habitats that are taking over our landscape provide inadequate habitat for species to nest and rest and feed, and they're forced to adapt. So if you can imagine that all pollinators are forced to move into smaller and smaller plots of land, there then becomes more competition for resources, which of course has an impact, right? And so there's not a ton of global data about the sheer number of acres lost to development and deforestation. One report issued by the Environmental Working Group found that these 23 million acres of grassland and scrubland were converted to row crops and corn. The greatest losses, of course, occurred in the Midwest and the Great Plains. And so we're seeing agriculture being responsible for a 21% decline in the amount of milkweed, which is, of course, the host plant for the iconic monarch butterfly, over an 18-year period. In California, as much as 90% of the shallow areas prone to intermittent and seasonal flooding, called vernal pool habitats, have been lost over the last 2 decades. And so what's happening with habitat loss is sort of twofold. Obviously, there's less place for these animals, these pollinators to be, but there's also fewer resources for them to rely on. So if you can imagine in the vernal pool habitat, for example, the plants leave and then the pollinators leave too. And in some cases, pollinators can move and find habitat elsewhere that's suitable. But if you think about these sort of specialty pollinator plant relationships, where a pollinator depends on a specific plant or a plant depends on a specific pollinator, we then have issues because once the plants disappear, the pollinators disappear and vice versa. So that's what I was saying about biodiversity. If we lose the pollinators that pollinate these specific plants, we also lose the plants. And one of those plants I'm talking about is called the yellow carpet. And it's disappearing altogether from the landscape. It's a brilliant yellow floral host for a namesake yellow bee called the yellow carpet solitary bee. And these bees are native to California, and they rely on these flowers. And so when the flowers disappear, the pollinators disappear and vice versa. So we need to be thinking about that. Now, there are a number of efforts to establish pollinator habitat, and they are in states, counties, local municipalities. They've all invested in pollinator habitat restoration, and of course in our own backyards. So whether you are working with a large company, somebody like a Burt's Bees, a General Mills, a Toyota, a Haagen-Dazs, or a Boeing, these are all very large corporations that have invested in restoring pollinator habitat, and they are making sure that pollinators have a place to go. And those efforts are really important. But individual homeowner efforts matter too. And I want to use something that a horticulturalist at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center told me when I visited there. If you've ever had the chance to go to the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, which is in Austin, Texas, it's a very unique place in that it's this very large, I think 280 some acre wildflower garden essentially, but it is right in the middle of a whole lot of development. And there's these kind of cookie cutter neighborhoods, you know, the ones with the new construction with the very small lawns, and there's kind of a freeway around one edge of it. And I said to the horticulturalist, Leslie Uppinghouse, does it really matter if you're on a postage-sized yard, postage stamp-sized yard, and you plant habitat for pollinators? Is that really going to make a difference? And she said, we need to think about the yards like a quilt. So in other words, if everybody takes time to plant a little bit of habitat, the pollinators can more easily move between the quilt squares, and that allows them to move more freely around the city. And I thought that was a really apt description of how a homeowner, even one with a small yard, can start to make a difference in terms of pollinator habitat. And so we really need to be thinking about how we can protect these habitats, and in areas where habitat has been destroyed, how we can do our part to bring back some of that lost habitat so that pollinators have a place to be. So the next major issue with pollinator habitat is pesticide use, and this gets talked about a lot. In particular, neonicotinoids, which are the most widely used insecticides in the world. They are currently used on 140 crops in 120 countries. And as you all know, these insecticides are systemic. They're taken up by the root system. They make the entire plant toxic. And so what we're seeing with neonicotinoids in particular, but pesticides in general, is that it's been linked to both lethal and sublethal effects. So, of course, the lethal effect, that's really obvious. It's killing the pollinator. So the pollinator goes to the plant, tries to feed on the nectar, and it ends up dying. But there are also sublethal effects. And so what we're seeing in honeybees, which are the most widely studied because, again, they're managed, and so it's really easy for researchers to go in and take a look at what's happening with honeybees and how exposure to these pesticides has impacted the hive is there are all of these sublethal effects, which range from a loss of sense of direction to things like other cognitive effects. They sometimes have a deformed wing virus and other things that make it hard for the bees in particular to do their jobs. And so they impact their physiology and behavior. So if you think about it, you know that some of the bees in the hive, their job is to go out into the world and bring nectar and pollen back to the hive. And if they cannot find the plants because their sense of direction is mixed up, or they can't find their way back to the hive, then they cannot feed the rest of the hive, and of course the hive could perish as a result. So even though these are considered sublethal effects, they can have lethal results. And so these are really important things to be thinking about. As a result of some of these pesticide issues, countries in the European Union have banned the use of 3 neonics on flowering crops. Of course, it doesn't mean that they're banned on non-flowering crops. And then we're also seeing other efforts like the major manufacturers, Syngenta, Bayer, and Valent, have agreed to a ban of 12 of the pesticides. And so we're seeing some action in this regard. Nurseries, too, are taking a step to ban pesticides. So at small nurseries and major garden centers, like the ones operated by Lowe's and Home Depot, you can get neonicotinoid-free plants. They are now tagged to show that they have not been sprayed with these pesticides. And that's one way that, you know, landscapers and homeowners can be assured that they are not promoting the use of pesticides, these pollinator killing pesticides on landscape plants. But it's not just neonicotinoids that we need to worry about. Although pesticides are, in general, designed to kill pests, and that's really important, herbicides, which are, of course, designed to kill weeds, also have impacts too. So, for example, herbicides, when sprayed around agricultural areas before crop planting, have been connected to mass losses of milkweed, which, as I'm sure you know, is the sole source of food for monarch larvae. And so we're also seeing the introduction of herbicide-resistant crops like Roundup Ready corn and soybeans. And again, even though these are not plants that pollinators are depending on as sources of food, the applications do kill milkweed because they're sprayed pretty broadly. Researchers have estimated that there's been an 81% decline in monarch populations and a 58% in decline in milkweed, over the last 2 decades. And so we really need to think about what we're spraying and when we're spraying it. Now, there are, of course, some crops where it's really, really hard to grow certain things. Fruit trees are a good example without some pest or herb control. And what research is showing is that if you can control when you're spraying, so for example, using applications later in the evening when the pollinators have retired for the evening, is important and can help limit their exposure. So those are things that we need to be thinking about as well, and making sure that we are not using herbicides thoughtlessly. It needs to, there needs to be a significant amount of care in making the decision of what and when to spray. Okay. Next up is invasive species. So I'm sure that you all know, because it's the ELA, the importance of planting native plants and removing invasive species. When invasive species take over a landscape, right, this is an extreme example of what happens. They spread on their own, they outcompete native plants, they threaten biodiversity, and they contribute to habitat loss. And so there is nothing in this photo that a pollinator can depend on for food, for nesting grounds, you know, shelter, sure, but little else. And so we need to be thinking about removing invasive species. And there have been several examples of, you know, English ivy or honeysuckle culls that have happened at different parks where people have really been focused for sometimes years, sometimes decades on removing the invasive species. And what they're seeing is a pretty big increase in the return of native pollinators. So just rooting this stuff out can increase pollinator abundance and diversity, which is really important. But it's not an easy task, as you all know. There's a park called Forest Park where volunteers have been participating in an annual honeysuckle kill for 20 years, and they're still struggling with the invasive species. And of course, you really want to make sure that when you're doing this work, that you're not doing it with pesticides, because of course that can negatively impact any pollinator species that are still in the area. Here, invasive species in the US cause about $120 billion in annual damage. And of course, our two biggest issues in terms of national threats are English ivy and Japanese honeysuckle. The invasive species in your area may change depending on where you're located. I have, in North Carolina, we have a major issue with Japanese honeysuckle. It is everywhere. So removing invasive species and replacing them with native plants is a really good option for making sure that native pollinators have a place to nest, okay? The U.S. Forest System has done, U.S. Forest Service has conducted several studies looking at ripping up acres of Chinese privet. And they started this project in 2002. And 5 years later, less than 1% of their test sites were covered with privet, compared with 60% of the untreated sites. And they continue to go back every couple of years to keep the site clean. They were using things like machetes, mulching machines, chainsaws, and eventually an herbicide spray to prevent resprouting. And some of it came back, but the work has been pretty effective. And they actually went from 100% coverage in some areas to less than 5%. And then the U.S. Forest Service did some research to see what the impact on pollinators was of ripping out that Chinese privet. And they found that privet-free sites, so the sites where the invasive species had been removed, had almost 3 times as many pollinator species and 4 times more individual pollinators than control sites. And so obviously this is an important way to help pollinator species. But it's not just invasive plant species that we need to be thinking about. So we need to be thinking about invasive animal species as well. And what they found on a remote island in New Zealand is that in the absence of native pollinator species, other species like a ship rat, a literal rat that came off a ship, they were actually doing the work of pollinators. And they're less effective, as you would imagine, than native pollinators. And so even when other creatures step in to take over the role, the biodiversity in the environment still suffers. And so even though these invasive species can become crucial pollinators, they also are not nearly as effective as maintaining the native species. And so we need to be thinking about rooting out invasive species of both insects and mammals. So that's important too. The last major threat facing pollinators is climate change. So in the last by 2050, the average temperature is set to increase 2 to 4 degrees. And hand in hand with that, the arrival of spring is advancing by 2.3 days per decade. Now, this might not seem like a lot. A couple degrees in a couple of days might not seem like a big deal. But if you're a pollinator, this can in fact be a very big deal. And it's because pollinators depend on plants and plants depend on pollinators, of course. And often they have sort of mutual emergent times. And so some species of plants and pollinators use daylight as a cue to emerge. So in other words, when we change the clocks and we start having longer days, both the plants and the pollinators say, oh, it's my time. In other cases, they use temperature. And so it's depending on the temperature, that's when it comes time to emerge. Now, if you can imagine that two species that depend on each other, a plant and a pollinator, use different cues, they may not emerge at the same time. And so when the pollinator comes out, the plant may have already stopped flowering, which leaves the pollinator with little source for nectar or shelter or nesting space. Or if the plant comes out and there's no pollinator there to pollinate it, then the plant's species is threatened. And this is exactly what happened in North Carolina, where a biology professor who was studying sweet shrub, which is a native woodland plant that flourishes in the mountains of North Carolina. And she would go out every spring in the forest and she would check the bloom time. And every time she opened up the petals, these sap beetles would flow out. And then she started noticing that so this is happening season after season, and then she started noticing that, that when the spring temperatures went up and the sweet shrub bloomed earlier, she would go out and look into the petals and there were no beetles. And so what she found out was that as the timing of spring was changing and these two species used different cues about when to be active and reproduce, they were missing each other. And so this is obviously detrimental to both the plant and the pollinator. Now, unlike other issues, it's really difficult to control climate change. So we can restore habitat, right? Or we can prevent its loss in the first place. We can minimize or completely eliminate pesticide and herbicide use. We can remove invasive species, but we can't simply turn down the temperature on the planet. And so what's happening is pollinators are doing their best to adapt. And in some cases, they're shifting their habitats and changing their migration patterns. So we're definitely seeing a northward migration. They're moving to cooler climates because their normal habitat is getting too hot. And they're also changing their migration patterns. And so hummingbirds are a good example of this. They are often overwintering up north in places where they've not been seen over the winter before. The Audubon Society does some really amazing bird counts, and they have found that people are seeing hummingbirds, including the rufous hummingbird, at their feeders at times when they should be far further south. And the other thing that's happening is that when pollinators do not go to their normal nesting grounds, they end up staying in places where they're not normally found at the times of the years they are not supposed to be there, and that increases competition for resources. And so everybody is kind of losing out. And it's the same thing with migrating northward. They're going into places where other pollinator species are living, and there's more competition for resources. And so we're not sure, of course, because this is kind of an ever-evolving issue, we're not sure what the long-term effect is going to be and how pollinators are going to respond to climate change, but they appear to be, like I said, moving and changing their migration patterns, and that's an issue. So in Texas, there is a cave where bats spend most of their time, but they are used to migrating to Mexico for the winter. And these bats, they live in colonies that can number in the tens of millions. And in their cave, which is called Bracken Cave near San Antonio, they have been staying. So they're not going into Mexico in the winter. And between 1954 and 1956, there were no bats in Bracken Cave during the winter. So when the temperatures were dropped in Texas, they left. But starting in the mid-1990s, researchers started finding bats in Bracken Cave during the winter. And ever since then, the number of bats that remain in the cave over the winter has continued to increase. Now it's about 300,000, it's believed to be. So, of course, this is causing problems because the longer the bats stay in the cave, the more that bacteria and fungus build up in the cave, causing diseases. So that's an issue. Parasites are more virulent, they're more widespread disease. And also, because they're not leaving the cave, there's a lot of inbreeding that's happening, and that is threatening their chance of survival. And so there's efforts now to look at more caves to see if this is happening in more areas of the country to kind of assess what is happening with these bats. But this is believed to be something that is going to be not just bat specific, but this is going to happen with all pollinators, where we're seeing a little bit more of this, especially with mammals like bats. Okay. So what can we do? I am going to talk a little bit about some of the efforts that we can make to protect pollinators. And before I go into this, I think this is a nice place for me to say that if you have questions, please type them into the question box, and I will answer them as they come up, okay? So what can we do? I think as landscapers, you have a lot of opportunity to make suggestions and educate your clients and be advocates for protecting our pollinators, because a lot of this stuff is really garden specific. So planting habitat, including native species, is a really important way to bring back habitat and restore places for pollinators to feed and nest and rest. I think it's really important to talk to homeowners about what native plants are and where they can find them. One of the things that I have found in my research is that there's a lot of misunderstandings about what is native, and a lot of mistaken belief that just because something grows in a place does not make it a native species. So as a test, I went into our local Lowe's garden center and I said to the person working, hey, can you tell me where you keep the native plants? And Lowe's has no native plants that I could find. And the person working at the Lowe's Garden Center said, all of our plants are native plants. And that's of course not true, but if you tell a homeowner that, what you could end up leaving with is Japanese honeysuckle. So it's really important to provide some education about what native species are and why they make sense in the landscape. And I think depending on where you are, your homeowners may be really interested in learning about things like parasite resistance and drought tolerance, especially in areas like California, where there are frequently water restrictions. So that's a really important place to start. I think, and I'm sure you all have found this, but you have to spend a lot of time dispelling myths that native plants are somehow unattractive and it will look like some sort of weird forest instead of a nice garden. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for learning there. Let the lawn grow a little longer. I would, of course, add to this, minimize the amount of lawn that you have to start with, but letting the lawn grow a little longer means that things like dandelions have a chance to sprout up. And, you know, depending on where you live, I'm in North Carolina, we already have dandelions sprouting up in our lawn. It is the first food that's available to a lot of these pollinators in the springtime. So it might not be particularly pretty, and I know that people love to get out there and attack them with a spray bottle, but letting the lawn grow a little longer and letting some of the dandelions and clover pop up provides a really important and lush buffet for pollinators. And so if you can encourage your homeowners to cut the grass every 2 weeks instead of every week, you can actually have a really big impact. Or if you are doing any yard maintenance, if you can try to encourage that, it can have a really important impact on pollinators. Next, break up with mulch. Everybody loves mulch. It does make a garden look really finished, but most of our native pollinator species are ground nesting. And if you can imagine a little tiny bee trying to move a giant piece of mulch in order to find a bare spot of ground for nesting, that sounds like something out of a Looney Tunes cartoon. It's really difficult for our ground nesting species to find places to nest when all of the bare ground is covered in mulch. So if you can leave bare areas of soil to provide some places for these ground nesting bees, we can do a good job of working to improve pollinator habitat. Provide clean water. I mean, I think it goes without saying any species needs clean water, and you can do things like bird baths, pictured here. If you want to put out little feeders or watering stations for butterflies and bees, you just want to keep the water really shallow, or fill a bird bath with small stones where these teeny tiny creatures can perch, but it gives them a great spot to drink and provides another essential element of habitat. Next, we talked about avoiding pesticides and removing invasive species. Again, these are really important strategies to helping pollinator populations rebound. And then supporting pollinator-friendly businesses may not seem like a first line of defense, for example, to help restore pollinator populations, but I do believe in the idea that we vote with our wallets. And so the more that we can seek out businesses that are making an effort to support our pollinators, the more that they will continue to do those things. So they're doing everything from supporting pollinator populations by planting habitats and avoiding the use of pesticides, to donating funds to nonprofit organizations that are working to protect these species. Some companies like General Mills are also providing free seed packets to help gardeners protect and plant their own pollinator habitats. And so I think that we can let them know that their efforts matter when we make sure to support these businesses, call them out on social media, buy their products, et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly, I wanted to talk for a minute about participating in citizen science projects. So there's a whole chapter in my book about citizen science and the importance in not only identifying what's happening to pollinator species, but giving researchers clues about what needs to be done to protect them. And these projects range from things you can do, you know, most of them are things you can do without leaving your house. So counting birds, counting butterflies, those kinds of things. And what they do is they give researchers really important data on what's happening in various parts of the country about pollinator populations. And so the Audubon Society, as I mentioned earlier, does the Great Backyard Bird Count. They do a couple of them There's the monarch larva mapping project, which maps monarch larvae on milkweed. And I'm sorry, it's the monarch larva monitoring project, MLMP. And there are all sorts of efforts like this that allow regular people to get involved in science and provide data sets that researchers wouldn't have otherwise. So there's Monarch Watch, Monarch Joint Venture, etc. And this data is being used to help guide decisions about pollinator protection and provide important information about pollinator species. And so if you're interested at all in contributing to science, some of this stuff is really great stuff that can be done with kids. Now that we have access to the internet, it's much easier for scientists to collect large data sets. And so it's a really great way to get involved, especially if you are already doing all of the other things that we've talked about during the session. So that's something I would definitely suggest considering. So all of these things taken together can have a really significant impact on our pollinator populations. And the more you can do, the more of these things you can incorporate into your lives and into your work, the bigger impact that you can have. It's one of those things that every little effort can add up to one big impact. And that's, I think, the way that we need to think about protecting pollinator populations. Because if we really don't start making some significant efforts, we're going to see, we've already started to see, and we're going to continue to see a lot of these populations become threatened, endangered, or completely extinct. And that's going to have a irreversible impact on not only our food supply, but our biodiversity and just the health of our planet in general. And so that's why I'd love you to think about how you can protect pollinators in all aspects of your work and your life. And I'm happy to take questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This was very interesting and motivating for all of us. We do have just a few questions. The first is, you talked a lot in the beginning of your presentation about the impact of on pollinators in agricultural settings, and the question is, shouldn't we also be concerned about pollination for repropagating flowering plants as well?
Absolutely, and I think that that's a great question. I think that's one of the reasons that we're concerned about habitat loss, because once the plants are lost, there's, once the land use changes and the plants are lost, we're in dire straits. And we certainly can't be depending on nurseries and bees floating in and out, or whatever pollinators floating in and out, to do all the repropagating of these plants. We need there to be also wild populations in order to sustain, meaningful levels of these plants. They need to also be growing in the wild and in addition to being propagated. Does that answer your question?
Yes. The next is about urban and suburban development. Hasn't that really caused an even greater impact on habitat loss than just agriculture?
So, of course, any development, anytime you change land use, you have an impact on pollinator populations. Absolutely. And so we do need to think about, every time we put up an office building or a large neighborhood, suburban neighborhood with these tiny lawns. But when researchers look at pollinator abundance and diversity in rural and urban areas, the pollinator populations surprisingly do better in urban areas, because we do a bit better of a job in our urban areas of creating habitats. So if you think about any landscape that you might be creating, or homeowners planting vegetable gardens and those types of things, there's less of a monoculture in urban areas, unless we're talking about lawns, which are, of course, a major issue. But there's a lot more plant diversity in urban and suburban areas than you see in a lot of rural areas where landscapes have been either converted to agriculture or are, say, forested, and there may not be a lot of diversity in the forest or a lot of really great nectar plants on the forest floor. So pollinators do fare better in those more densely packed areas, shockingly, but we need to be concerned about development no matter where it happens, because we are seeing populations being pushed out for sure. Anytime you take a wild area and you pave over it for roads and houses and driveways and those sorts of things.
Very good. The next question is about invasives. If I remove invasives in an area of my yard now and leave the ground bare until fall, when we have better survival rates for new plantings, is this the right strategy, or should I leave the invasives and pull them in the fall?
That's a really good question. So I would say it depends on what your invasive is. So in the case of something like English ivy, which provides no meaningful source of food for a pollinator, you can go ahead and remove it. In the case of something like Japanese honeysuckle, which is a little like, I liken some of these nectar-producing invasive species to fast food. So if you're comparing the McDonald's of invasive species like a Japanese honeysuckle to nothing, at least the pollinator has the opportunity to get some nectar and pollen from that type of invasive species, which they would not have otherwise. So I think it really depends. It's a really smart question, and I think it really depends on what your invasive is and what it might be adding to your landscape at a time when little else might be available. So you have to take that into consideration.
Okay. The next is a comment. This is from someone who apparently has been to Lowe's in other states and finds that although most are cultivars, they do have some native plants in their Lowe's. So just wanted to go on record.
I'm so glad to hear that. I am in a very rural area, about an hour outside of any kind of city of size, and we do not. I scoured, this was 2 years ago when I wrote the book, so I scoured 2 years ago and did not see any natives. But that is good to know, because I do know that otherwise in my area we're depending on native plant sales and other things which may only come along once a season in order to access native plants, or we're doing mail order. And so it's good to know that there are the big box stores carry some in some areas. Thank you.
Yes, good. The next is a question about the statistics that you referenced about percentage of endangered species loss. The question is just, where can we reference that information?
Do you mean because I cited a few statistics. So if you're referring to the 200,000 different species of pollinators and 50% are endangered, is that the one?
I'm not sure.
I don't know.
I'm not sure what they're referring to.
Okay, if that is the question, if that is the statistic, that is a it's on the tip of my tongue. Can you email me, whoever that was? Let me pop my email address back up. And you can see it. But if you'll email me, it's the Center for Biological Diversity put out a report Center for Biological Diversity put out a report with that statistic, and I'm happy to send you the link if you'll shoot me an email. And for some reason, I have to go backwards and not forward, so we'll get back there. Sorry if anybody is having Blair Witch Project flashbacks as I race through this. But I'm happy to send you the link, and I apologize for not having it handy on a resources section. There's my email right there.
All right, thank you. The next question, when a perennial plant is sprayed with neonics, will it have neonics in its tissues from one season to the next?
Ooh, that is a good question. I don't know the answer. I'm not sure. I'm happy to look that up. Again, if you want to email me, I'm happy to do the research. I would, I would think that some of that, and I'm just thinking out loud here, but I would think that some of that would depend on which plant. So is it, and where you are located. So for example, some of my perennials in North Carolina will maintain their flowers and foliage, especially their foliage, for longer than they would in Canada where I grew up. And so that might make it easier for them to remain in the tissues, but I do not know the answer. It's a very good question.
All right. This is a suggestion. In addition to mowing less frequently, you mentioned every other week. This suggestion is to set your lawnmower to the highest setting and only mow when the grass gets above 5 inches, because that will provide some additional pollinator support.
Yep, absolutely. That's a great suggestion. Yes. And as long as you don't have an HOA coming out to measure your lawn, you should be good. That's a question. That's a comment I get a lot. I'd love to mow my lawn every other week, but my homeowners association would be on me. So yes, that's a great suggestion to raise the height of the mower.
Yes. The next is a comment in this region. This listener is from New England. Wild strawberry, woolly blue violet are also good choices to introduce, along with dandelions and clover that you mentioned.
Yep, perfect. Definitely. I mean, my advice is, if something is growing wild in your area that you know is not invasive, just leave it alone. You know, the old saying, give peace a chance. You just need to give these quote unquote weeds a chance. Some of these wild plants that pop up are really important nectar sources for pollinators. And I just think that we need to think twice about what we're introducing or eliminating from our landscape. So that's a really good suggestion.
The next is, do you have a suggestion for how we can evaluate businesses to know if they are supporting pollinators or are pollinator friendly?
That's a really good question. So there are a couple of ways to do it. There is something called bee friendly certification, which is BEE, friendly certification, that companies, especially food companies, can get from the Xerces Society, and the Xerces Society is XERCES Society, to show that they are using pollinator-friendly practices. And that is one way to evaluate sort of food producers. It's a fairly new certification, and it's one of only a few. So if you're shopping for food, that's one way to do it. The Xerces Society, which is in Portland, Oregon, also talks a lot on its website about its partnerships with other organizations. And a lot of companies now have on their website their pollinator friendly or protection practices. So if you were to Google the name of a company, so let's say you're trying to buy a car or a van for work or whatever, and you want to know if that auto manufacturer is doing anything for pollinator habitat or protection, I would just Google something like General Motors pollinator habitat, or Kia pollinator habitat. I don't know anything about cars. I don't know why I chose that example, but Look up, just turn to Google and see if any company that you are interested in supporting or curious about supporting is also supporting pollinator protection. It's a little easier with food than it is with larger corporations, because things like the Bee Friendly certification and, of course, organic certification, their requirements are stringent because they want to protect, the planet. But it is a little trickier with companies. You'll have to do a little bit more research.
Okay. The next is a question about switching to organic methods of soil function, organic methods, and trying to improve your soil without impacting negative impacts as a means of pollinator support.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure of the question. How do you improve your soil without impacting pollinators?
I think the question is, have you investigated changing to organic methods as a means of pollinator support?
Yeah, absolutely. So anytime that you're embracing organic principles, you are having an impact on pollinators, because, of course, organic is really about minimizing the products that you're using. So these OMRI labeled products have minimal impact on pollinator populations and less impact on nectar quality and things like that. So you absolutely want to be thinking about going organic when you can in an effort to help pollinators. I will say that even if you embrace organic 100%, there's still more that you can do to protect pollinators. So, for example, organic has regulations for what kind of mulch you can use, but it does allow you to use mulch. And so that's one thing that it wouldn't necessarily cover. So, you need to be thinking about all of the efforts, but organic is a good place to start. And it's also something that if you are trying to talk to clients, that people sort of understand and have a better grasp of. So when you talk to them about using organic methods, that may be something that they feel like they can really wrap their heads around, because they understand what that means and what that might look like, and it may be a more familiar term to them. But I would definitely think about organic, but think beyond organic as a way to protect pollinators.
Great. Is there a place that you can recommend to find more citizen science projects than the ones that you mentioned?
Oh, that's a good question. So there is a citizen science clearinghouse is not the right word. There's a website called citizenscience.gov that talks a little bit about doing citizen science projects. The National Geographic Society also has a list. That's nationalgeographic.org. And if you Google search citizen science projects, they have a list of where you can find citizen science projects. It's getting more and more common. So people are excited to get involved. So everybody from like the EPA to PBS has lists of citizen science projects. And the lists, I will tell you, can be a little overwhelming because these are not pollinator specific. So I, again, would say Google and just type in citizen science. And if there's a particular pollinator that you're interested in or a particular plant that you're interested in, focusing on, see if there are projects with those specific parameters, because these ones that I mentioned are just general citizen science projects. So they may be everything from, watching for meteors to counting ants. They could be all over the board.
Okay, great. Well, we are running out of time, so I'm going to close with one recommendation from one of our viewers. and that is to check out Doug Tallamy's new book, Nature's Best Hope, which addresses many of the topics that you've been covering today. So thank you for that recommendation. So thank you, Jodi.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate your time.